So thanks very much, Miriam. I'm going to talk today about a book that I've just edited with Leif Stenberg at the Aga Khan University on what is Islamic Studies. And it's specifically looking at European and North American approaches to Islamic studies. We're not looking at those from the West Asia or South Asia, important though they are. We're just, this is our focus here. So next slide, please. So that was our cover for the book. And one of the things that cover is trying to evoke that no Muslim is just a Muslim. The man on the bike is a Muslim, and so is the woman walking along in the road. So part of the emphasis was on kind of de-essentializing the Muslimness in Islamic studies, to say that in all these cases, being a Muslim is just one part of individuals' identities. I'm not going to talk about the whole of the book, just a couple of snippets from the introduction. And one of the things we try and set out in the introduction is a map of how Islamic studies has developed and why it is so varied, why it's not the same thing in different countries. Next slide, please. So we find a number of different axes of difference, why these intellectual traditions have diverged in different places. As Edward Said famously observes, a lot of study of the Orient, of Orientalist writing, had a colonial subtext. And this is especially true for Britain, France, or the Netherlands. But something we try to interrogate in this book is that we can't simply generate generalizations about the whole of the West. Sweden or Switzerland or Croatia don't have those kinds of colonial entanglements. And so Islamic studies trajectories that are produced in those countries, I don't think there are places that we can fairly say they're implicating the same kind of colonial subtext. But what I would say about all of Islamic studies within Western Europe is that it's embedded within Semitic studies. It tends to prioritize the Middle East, and it tends to prioritize comparison between Semitic languages. And I think that's where a lot of it starts, on Turkish and Persian, and then kind of bolted on. And so that's tend to be that Semitic studies is, I think, part of the genealogy of Islamic studies, and that takes priority over a wider field of religious studies. So the focuses tend to be to compare Arabic literature to that in Syriac or Hebrew, rather than, say, compare Islam to Zoroastrianism. Now, then, the twist that we're all very familiar with from Edward Said's writing is to point to the colonial lineage for Islamic studies in the United States, of Orientalism. And this is an area that I think pays a lot of dividends for Said's critique. He's saying the United States, which claims not to be a colonial country, not to be engaged in imperialism, actually has at its core these group of intellectuals who've been trained in Britain and France and Germany. And that's true. Now, there are scholars like von Grunebaum and Gibb who give birth to American Orientalism. But we would argue actually that lineage is relatively unimportant, because what goes on in American Oriental studies is really not philology, but area studies. And its obsession is about finding agents for change for democracy in the Muslim world. So its agenda is actually quite different from the interests of philologists who've been working in Germany or France before. I think, yes, next slide, please. A second axis of difference has been labour migration. Different European countries have very different demographics, very different links to South Asia and West Asia. And there's a lot of discussion about whether one can talk about a British Islam or a French Islam. I would say primarily these are imaginations of a small group of entrepreneurs and governments who sponsor them. And by and large, we'd be much safer in talking about a Kashmiri Islam or an Algerian Islam in terms of generalizing about the European Muslim experience. That's not to say, of course, that there are small, Europe is an important place for the experimentation with things like the role of LGBT rights within Islam, for instance. But this is not the majority discourse. Next slide, please. Just to conclude, I think a major difference that separates the European and North American approach to Islamic studies is that in North America, Jewish studies would act as a trailblazer in many ways. Of course, since the Second World War, North America has hosted a much larger and more vocal, more prosperous Jewish community than Europe. And this has encouraged other groups to try and follow in its wake. We see that for African American studies or Iranian studies in different ways. And I think Islamic studies can be seen in that context. So just the one word of conclusion, final slide, is that often people try and describe the Islamic world and the West and make a contrast. And a lot of people who spend a lot of time and effort differentiating between different Muslim approaches would still talk about the West in general. And what we want to emphasize is that that differentiation deflects from internal and historical variation within both an Islamic world and the West. Thank you very much.